Legislatures back in session. Senator Espadon, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, before we broke yesterday, I had made a motion to set the bill before us aside to allow legal counsel to take a look at several issues. And I believe that maybe that recess that we took provided the legal counsel with the ability to look over some of the constitutionality issues that were possibly raised. But at this time, I'd like to withdraw my motion and allow the discussion to proceed.
On the motion to withdraw, is there any objection? Hearing no objection, motion carries. Is there anyone else who hasn't spoke on the bill who would like to be recognized? If not, Senator Atta, you may close on the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, there was very good discussion yesterday on the bill, and I certainly appreciate the input that was provided. However, in my closing remarks here, I would just like to address a few points that were raised yesterday. One is a point was raised asking, so how does Bill 154 affect the existing sign law? And to that, Bill 154 does not take away from the existing sign law, which governs only the on-premise signs. And so Bill 154 expands the authorization of signage in our community by allowing for the construction and operation of off-premise signs and the operation of digital signs, which takes advantage of new technology in the sign industry. A second point was raised about that giving DPW the power to authorize on the basis of objective criteria makes for a less transparent process. And to that I would respond, I guess with a question of, well, how is this different when one wants to construct a house? There are specified criteria that's in place by the building code, by EPA, and all. And so once those criteria have been met, then DPW will grant the building permit, and it doesn't have to go through GLUC and all. And so construction approval for off-premise signs will also be based on a set of objective criteria. For example, signs can only be erected in certain areas that are zoned accordingly. There's criteria about the location of signs, the height, the size, and you'll see all that in pages 5 through 11 of the bill. Now, it's also important to emphasize that the criteria are modeled after guidelines promulgated by the National Sign Council, and certainly are not just arbitrary criteria that was dreamt up. Thirdly, establishing objective criteria upon which approvals are to be based makes for greater certainty in how we move forward with developments in our community. So I know that before I go planning for the construction of whatever, I know what the constraints are, and so it'd be best to move forward within those parameters. But we also know that there are times when legitimate exceptions to the rules would warrant a variance, and Bill 154 does provide the option to seek a variance from the Guam Land Use Commission, as is reflected in Section 4, page 15 of the bill. And then when the application is sent down the variance path, then of course greater scrutiny will then ensue, with greater scrutiny from the Application Review Committee and from the municipal planning councils where this construction is to occur, prior to final review and approval from the Guam Land Use Commission. The concern was also raised that the Guam Land Use Commission process is better because an application must be vetted by the Municipal Planning Council for community input. And in the past, every application for the off-premise signs had to go through the Guam Land Use Commission because our law only provides for the on-premise signs. But we'll find that Bill 154 provides a requirement that a copy of the permit application must be provided to the respective municipal mayor for comments. See page 6, line 7 of the bill. And although the bill states that DPW's decision is final, I cannot recall when a strong objection from an MPC was summarily dismissed despite strong objections having been raised by that municipal planning council. So we still have provisions for the municipal planning council to provide for an input, and it's not something, an application for an off-premise sign, it's not something that will fly under the radar of the community that is being affected. The fourth point that was raised is that the concern that the interval restriction, that signs will be no closer than 3,500 feet from each other, is unfair to landowners within that interval. And I guess what we're trying to achieve here is a balance between the need to have a vehicle that uses current technology to convey information to the community and avoiding a clutter of signs along our roadways that provide a visual assault to people who are passing by. And the inevitable consequences of making compromises is that some degree of unfairness will occur, but for the greater good. And finally, the concern was raised, so we put up these signs, and how is enforcement to be made to ensure that the criteria are being maintained? So the bill is very clear on page 14 that DPW will be responsible for the enforcement of the rules, and that violations have associated penalties with them. The penalties include up to $1,000 per violation and an additional $300 per day for failure to take appropriate corrective action. You'll find that on page 15 of the bill. So with that, I ask my colleagues to favorably consider this sign bill. I think that it certainly, the committee has worked closely with it. It has worked with the industry. Not everybody got what they wanted. There were some industry stakeholders that wanted to see be allowed to put up signs that were 400 square feet as opposed to signs that were limited to 200 square feet. So that wasn't, a compromise that was made. But I think for the most part, the industry has had an opportunity to provide their input, and I think the bill is fair, and it certainly will serve our community well. So I ask my colleagues to favorably support Bill 154, and I move that the bill be placed in the voting file. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. On the motion to place Bill 154-34 on the third reading file, is there any objection? Hearing no objection, motion carries. We're still on second reading. We are now on Bill number 291-34. Senator Esteves, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move to place Bill 291 into the third reading file, and I'd like to speak on it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Please proceed. It's as introduced.
As
right?
introduced.
Please proceed.
Actually, Madam Speaker, I am going to have one amendment, and should I do it now or should I do it after? Okay. Actually, the amendment I have, and I'm going to prepare it and circulate it, is on page 1, between lines 9 and 10, and it is to strike the words except as provided in paragraphs B, C, and D and E of this section. So then it will now just read, a certificate that is amended under this section shall be marked amended, period. And the reason for this is the original intent was not to sign or stamp it amended. However, looking at other state models, they do have the provision stamped as amended. We did reach out to counterparts in the federal government specifically with regard to passports, and we haven't been able to get confirmation as to whether or not having the word amended or not having the word amended would affect an individual's ability once they've changed their identification on their birth certificate from getting a passport. We couldn't get confirmation, so we thought we would play it safe and keep it a model that we know works.
We're going to take a 1-minute recess. We're back from recess.
Thank
Senator
you, Madam
Esteves, you have the
Speaker.
floor.
I'd like to withdraw that amendment. Actually, the amendment should be to strike the added language, comma C and comma and E, which is just the language added in the original law. And again, the intended purpose, and that's to exclude them from stamping it amended. However, the intent is that they go ahead and stamp it amended. All the documents will be intact to be able to track these public proceedings, and so we just want to stay consistent through and through.
All right, so on the amendment would leave subparagraph B of the statute intact, meaning no changes will be made by this bill to subparagraph B. On the Esteves amendment, anyone like to be recognized? Is there any objection to the Esteves amendment? Hearing no yes, Senator Muñoz, you're recognized.
I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, so there's no amendment at all, or is there still a strike in?
He's amending the bill so that there is no amendment to subpart B in the statute. So that all the underlying sections will be removed. Okay. So it will read, except as provided in paragraphs B, D, B and D of this section. The and will be restored. B and D of this section. So he's removing the words C and E. On the amendment, on the Estevez amendment? Is there any objection to the Estevez amendment? Hearing no objection, motion carries. Senator
Thank you, Madam
Estevez.
Speaker. I introduced Bill 291 because there was a previous measure introduced which promoted the anti-discrimination and not to discriminate against members of the transgender community. After reviewing that and doing research into that, it really was clear to me that how can we mandate the population not to discriminate against these members of the community if the government does not do enough to recognize these members of our community? You know, I've been asked, and it's been a surprise to some, you know, as a Republican, why I would introduce such a bill. And, you know, just to add, I would just like to, you know, refer to the progenitor of our party, Abraham Lincoln, who understood that marginalized minorities were key members of this community and should be included. It was in his time, against all odds and against opposition, that he strongly believed and fought that freed slaves should have the opportunity to vote and participate and have all the civil liberties afforded to them. And with that in mind, we did the research. And the data is staggering. High rates of suicide, depression, sexual assault, sexual abuse, and it's indicative with other minority groups in the community of a marginalized people, a marginalized section of the population. Madam Speaker, I understand the arguments. Science. But science has been used to counter ideals of equal rights for a long time. African American studies on African Americans in previous days used to come out with analysis saying African Americans were subhuman. It was science. Can't argue that. Transgender and others of the LGBT community were just merely suffering from mental illness, even though reports and records of transgender people and those within the LGBT community go back to ancient times. Another thing that science has argued, women are incapable of certain tasks because of physical limitations. But what we see now, Madam Speaker, that African Americans and other minorities, members of the LGBT community, and women are all contributing members to society. Women, for example, are engaging in all sectors previously restricted to men. And while I acknowledge there's still a lot of work to be done, progress has been made and more progress can be made. The one thing science proves consistently in any argument, for any situation, for any marginalized group, is that we're all different kinds of different. Madam Speaker, I want to share a story. I was talking with a constituent about this bill. Gentleman approached me, was curious. He didn't understand it. This is not something that he normally deals with on a day-to-day, and he asked me, and we sat and we talked. Following, he pretty much came to the conclusion himself of why. He said, Senator, you know what? Yeah, it's a good idea. Why not? And he, you know, I just wanted to tell the story because he put it into very interesting words, which, you know, when other people ask me about it, I tell them the same thing because I think there's a lot of wisdom to it. And he said, well, you know, if a man were to lose his male parts, serving his country in a war, got blown up by an IED, is he any less of a man? Or if a woman had a mastectomy, does that make her any less of a woman? The answer is no on both instances, because it's not the parts that define us. Madam Speaker, you know as well as I do, it's been an arduous road to get this bill on the floor. And I believe that we owe these members of the community the opportunity to fully achieve their pursuit of happiness, to fully be able to participate without too many problems as members of this community. People don't realize the simple thing of having issues getting a driver's license, having issues getting housing, or the awkward conversations because a transgender person comes in for a job application dressed as a woman, how they identify, but their driver's license says male. We take these things for granted, but these are issues that have been consistent within this community, and we have a responsibility as a government to allow them the opportunity, to allow them the simple civil liberties afforded to everybody else to be able to pursue their dreams, to be able to pursue their goals. And so it's a very simple request, Madam Speaker. What this bill does, it allows them to go through a process through the court with similar to other amendments to birth certificates. This is nothing new, because the birth certificate is a source document. Birth certificate is not a sacred text. It is a source document for government purposes that we adjust, that everything else is derived from: library card, passport, social security card, driver's license. And so that's the intent and the purpose for addressing it in the birth certificate. You know, I've heard the criticism, and I've been asked, well, you can't adjust the birth certificate. It changes what happened at birth, but it happens all the time, and for the right reasons. For example, most people don't know that when parents adopt a child, they amend the birth certificate without stamping the word amended on it. Regardless of whether they were the birth parents or not, because it was a source document that was going to allow those parents to have the same procedures without additional complications as other parents. And so this is just in keeping with the intent in previous legislation, in other government processes, to address this issue that affects this segment of the community. And so I humbly ask my colleagues for their support to allow these individuals these same opportunities without all the additional complications that others in our community have. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. On the bill, is there anyone who'd like to be recognized on the bill? Senator St. Nicholas, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I have absolutely no problem with how anybody wants to identify, and I fully support it. My one concern that I had with this bill was with respect to the need to understand what the original sex was when it comes to the purpose of organ transplants. In my research, it's been indicated that organ transplants between the sexes actually poses different risks. Organ transplants between the sexes actually poses different risks. And I'm not a medical professional. I don't quite know what the process is for when an organ has been donated. I don't quite know what the process is to be able to identify the sex origin of that donated organ for the purposes of using it for medical transplants. And I just want to make sure that you know, this is a vital statistics document for a reason, and if there is no other, if the birth certificate is a key component in identifying the sex of the organ donor, I'm just concerned that that could be putting organ donations into a different risk category, because there may not be any other way to attach a sex orientation to the particular organ for the purposes of the medical transplant. And so I wanted to pose the question to the author. I did not see this issue being addressed in the committee report, but what are the safeguards for just making sure that we're not going to be creating unique medical risks because of the fact that organ transplants between sexes poses higher risks?
Do you yield to that question, Senator Esteves?
I do, Madam Speaker. Similar with any other organ donation, we've all done that where we've applied for a driver's license and there's a little check the block. medical professionals don't just put any organ in anybody. There's actually a process. Once somebody's been identified as an organ donor, they remove those organs and they're tested and checked to be good for the transplantee. There's also other lab testing that's done, such as blood typing. There are other options that we could look at, whether it's, are you an organ donor? Are you, have you addressed or changed your gender on your identification? But these are all tests, and so the comprehensive lab testing that they do on these organs to ensure they're not, well, one, putting in the wrong blood type on the organ, and number two, to ensure that they're not putting a bad organ into somebody, should be able to cover these different, this type of transplant. And so the tests are fairly conclusive, are fairly, I would say, inclusive and comprehensive to be able to identify this. However, we can go back and look, but I don't believe that this should be a delay on the bill. And so I hope that answers the question. But it's not going to be a random, put this organ in somebody. There's actually a lot of processes to that, and I'm sure this will be covered.
Senator San Nicolas, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. If you just do a basic Google search, it'll show that I put in here, can a male receive a female kidney? And the first thing that pops up here is female donor kidneys do not function as well in men due to their smaller size. Women have a higher risk of rejecting a male donor kidney. And so I have full respect for how people want to identify, but I also want to make sure that we're not putting other people at risk if there's any kind of issue with respect to the donee and the donor. So I understand that these things, the organs are tested, etc., for blood type or what have you. But when we're talking about transplanting an organ, I just want to make sure that all parties involved are fully aware of what the risks may be, to include the medical professionals and anybody else who's making the decision to either receive one organ or to wait on the list for another because the risks might be lower. This is something that we really need to discuss because this is a vital statistics document. I'm an organ donor. It's on my driver's license. I'm not quite sure what the process is with respect to identifying the source, the root gender of the donee. I don't know if this is going to pose a unique risk in medical circumstances, but that's something that I think we really need to be cognizant of. So I respect the answer from the move of the bill, but I'm not convinced that it addresses the medical concern. Perhaps this is something that we can set aside and have some kind of firm answer as to whether or not changing the sex on a birth certificate could complicate the identification of whether or not an organ is more or less suitable for a transplant from donor to donee. So I would like to, I guess, make that motion, Madam Speaker, just to get a clear understanding of that medical concern.
On the bill, is there any other member who would like to be recognized on the bill? Senator San Nicolas?
That's a motion, Madam Speaker, to set it aside for us to be able to, for the author of the bill to perhaps find a firm answer.
Oh. All right, there's a motion to set the bill aside. Is there any objection?
Madam Speaker, I'm going to object to the motion, and I'd like to speak on the objection. Again, the intent of this bill has a specific purpose, and I thought I made it clear there's a very specific process to harvesting organs. They're not picking up the person's shirt and removing them. These individuals are cleaned, dressed naked. It's members of the medical profession, all aspects of the medical profession, are taught to check, double check, triple check, quadruple check. They don't just look at a driver's license. They don't ask Department of Public Health for the birth certificate. What they do is they assess what the patient that they have in front of them. Because remember, this is not a new situation, this is not a new issue, because there are those in the transgender community that undergo the gender transformation surgery. And so medical professionals, as part of their continuing education, are educated on these things. And that's why they check, double check, triple check, quadruple check. This is nothing new. This is not a new process. Medical professionals are trained. In fact, the last time I did my CEUs for my EMT renewal, I did a whole course on specific transgender medical issues. And this was covered. And so I know the same thing goes on for nurses, the same thing goes on for doctors. And so I have 100% confidence that this is a non-issue. And with that, Madam Speaker, I object.
All right, there's been an objection. So all in favor of the motion to set the, Senator, can you specify set aside for how long? Just during this session, set aside to the bottom of the agenda?
I'd just like to get a medical professional to be able to affirm that changing this vital statistic document won't pose a unique risk for the purposes of identifying organs for transplant purposes. Once we get that, I'm totally fine, Madam Speaker, but I just want to make sure that we're not going to be creating a unique risk category and a potential liability. That's just something that I think it's a hurdle that we need to clear, and that's why I'm asking that we set it aside until we get some kind of firm answer from a medical professional with respect to the concern. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I'm going to interpret that to mean the motion is to set it aside on our agenda to in the bottom of the agenda until pending more information, or we could bring it back if more information is available sooner than that. And there's been an objection to the motion. All in favor of the motion to set aside, please raise your hand. Good. All right, motion fails. On the bill, is there anyone else who would like to be recognized? Senator Lee, you are recognized.
Suzus Masi, Madam Speaker, I'd like to request a brief 2-minute recess.
2-minute recess. back in session. Senator Lee, you have the floor. All right, on the bill, is there any other member who would like to be recognized on the bill? Senator San Augustine, you are recognized.
Madam Speaker, maybe the author will yield to the question. My concern is that if we allow a male to change his sex on his birth certificate as a female or the opposite, but through the course of his life or her life, she gets arrested. She's taken to the Ganya lockup, to any of the prisons, and they go to being a former police officer. They do a shakedown of the individual that was arrested before you go into confinement. They determine that you are of the opposite sex of what your identification recognizes you as. Does it cause the government to follow the ID or your physical appearance on where they put you? Because they do separate males and females in prison. They do not put you as a female in the male because you claim to be a male on your ID. That's my concern.
Is there any other member who'd like to be recognized on the bill? Senator San Augustine.
Excuse me, Madam Speaker. Maybe that could be considered a question to the author of the bill.
Would the author yield to the question from Senator San Augustine?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's common and it's been established that sex and gender are two different things. People may not agree, but that is the golden standard right now. Gender is the social construct in which somebody identifies, how they dress, how they act, and how they identify themselves. Sex is the physical makeup, the current biology at that time, which is different and it changes. So the same thing with the medical professional. There are numerous organizations and studies that put out training, and it's actually supposed to be continuing education for peace officers on dealing with members of the transgender community, this being included. For prisons and prisons specifically, whether Hagåtña Lockup or Department of Corrections, the standard right now is the sex of the individual, which means their current physical makeup pre-transition or post-transition. That's how they address it at the time. But, you know, I wouldn't be fair if I didn't say that they're still working on this and they're still discussing this at a federal level and at state levels. So this is not something that's been solved at this time, but the current standard is the sex of the individual. So, you know, again, I understand and I respect the concerns from members of this body on the what if, the small nuances. But this is the foot in the door at something bigger, because we'll never get to the point where we're addressing the details if we never address the issue. We can try to make it perfect and fine-tuned for every what-if situation, but again, this is not new legislation. I'm not claiming any glory by making this up. This is something that's been in practice. So, you know, there are definitely resources. I'm more than willing, and I have not disregarded the concerns of my colleagues, to provide them whatever material they're looking for to allay their concerns prior to the vote. And so I hope that answers the questions. To reconfirm and summarize, they will be treated depending on their sex, not their gender.
Senator San Augustine, you have the floor.
I'm not going to try to sound confused, Madam Speaker, but when I looked at my driver's license, if you change my birth certificate, driver's license says sex. When you're arrested, they don't look at what your gender is, they tell you what your sex is.
On the bill, is there any other member who'd like to be recognized on the bill? Senator Lee, you are recognized.
Madam Speaker, and I rise to commend the author of this bill. I think that it's very important that we create a space to have these discussions. There are many members of our community who are affected by some of the concerns raised in this bill, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion with my colleagues to talk a little bit about how it would affect individuals, but also our community with regard to medicine, with regard to law enforcement. And I think the one concern that I do have is, while I'm grateful that we're having this discussion, I also feel that this measure really needs additional time, but additional resources to be put in place to provide that continuing education to emergency first responders, to medical and legal professionals, as well as our law enforcement professionals. And that's just kind of what has come up in the past few minutes as we've been discussing this bill. So while I rise in support of this bill, I feel that this has kind of opened up many questions, which are good, and we need to continue to have this discussion. I want to thank the author for kind of giving us this space, but I also would reiterate the concern and maybe another motion to set this bill aside so we can get additional answers to these questions, and perhaps even identify additional resources that we could give to our government workers to assist these individuals, not just during the transition, but afterwards, and so that our entire community is better educated on how to deal with some of these challenges that we're discussing. Sijos Masi.
On the bill, is there any other member who would like to be recognized? Oh, sorry, is that a motion to set aside? On the motion to set aside, is there any objection? Just to the bottom of the agenda.
Yes, I just want to clarify. I'm not saying that we set it aside so that it goes somewhere and dies, but just to give us a little bit more time to flesh out some of our questions and to give the author an opportunity to receive those questions and be afforded the time to research and be able to respond, and not feel like we're under some serious pressure to get this done right this second. Sijos Masi.
On the motion to set aside, is there an objection?
If I could speak on a motion because I'm making the determination whether or not I'm going to object, if you'd allow, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm not opposed to setting it aside on the agenda, being the fact that 291 was actually further down on the agenda. And so I understand that maybe colleagues haven't had time to assess it. It was not the original intent in Committee on Rules to have addressed it this early. Again, I'm not opposed to setting aside on this agenda, but I would just ask that my colleagues provide all of their questions. This bill has been on the docket for months. This is the first time that these questions have come to my attention. I am more than willing to provide them the resources and answers that they are seeking. I just hope that the questions are asked in earnest, in an attempt to try to compromise and understand this piece of legislation. And again, this is no hit on my colleagues, but we are all aware that there are forces at work that would love to see this bill get killed, that would love to see this bill never get voted on. That is a fact. And so I do not object to the motion to set it aside on this agenda, but I hope that we do so in the spirit of compromise, in the spirit of understanding. And I ask that we get all of the questions provided so that we can get my colleagues the answer to help them make their decision.
On the motion to set aside, all in favor, please raise your hand. Oh, no objection? I'm sorry. So there's been no objections. Hearing no, is there any objection?
Madam Speaker, on the end of the priority bills, not on the third and additional.
So the motion is to place the bill following Bill number 348 on our agenda. Is there any objection to that motion? Hearing no objection, motion carries. We are now on Bill 298-34. Senator Atta, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I move to place Bill 298-34 COR as amended by the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform to the third reading file. I'd like to speak on it.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, yesterday was passed out two handouts. There was one handout that shows Bill 298-34, and it says Handout 1 on the upper right-hand corner. And there was also another handout like this, which shows a artist's rendition of the development that's to take place on the property that's subject property here. So Bill 298, if you refer to the handout number 1, is a small piece of property that involves 6.1 I'm sorry. Is a piece of property approximately 274 square meters. And just to orientate you on where this property is located, so if you take a look at the handout that says Bill 298-34 Handout 1, you'll see there on the far left side of the graphic Route 3. That's the road that goes up to Nicktams. And then there's that intersection that turns off to the east, and that's the Isengsong Road. And you'll see close to that intersection of the Route 3 and Isengsong Road is colored in orange, Lot 31, Block 2. That lot is the one that consists of approximately 274 square meters. Right now, that is actually a ponding basin, a natural ponding basin. And so I would refer you to the handout number 2 behind that. And it shows where this hole in the ground, which belongs to the government, is located. And it's located right within a consolidated lot that's almost, you'll see it almost looks like an L-shaped lot. And in this L-shaped lot, the owner of that consolidated property wants to develop that, but needs, as any development, needs to be able to capture the water that flows from that property. So certainly this government, but it has to have it on its property. And so by the owner of this consolidated lot then is asking to purchase this 274 square meter piece of property that you see there on handout number 2 to make it a part of their property and be able to meet the drainage requirements of the development to take place. In the other handout here is an artist's rendition of the development that's going to be put on this L-shaped piece of property. And basically they're going to have a service station there and a strip mall, a small strip mall there And if you look at the attached, the second page to that artist rendition, that sinkhole is actually located right where, almost towards the bottom of the drawing, that small white square, and it's a rectangular piece of property with a north-south orientation. So that, Madam Speaker, is what Bill 298 proposes to do, is to then authorize the government to sell that piece of government, that 274 square meters of property. The proceeds of the sale will go into the Chamorro Land Trust Survey and Infrastructure Fund. Appraisals have already been done. It's in the committee report. I believe the average of the two appraisals comes up to about $19,000. So that will go into the Chamorro Land Trust Survey and Infrastructure Fund. Of course, once the sale has been transacted, that whole lot again will be resurveyed and consolidated, and will provide then a new tax base for the government. And so that, Madam Speaker, in a nutshell, is the objective and the purpose of Bill 298-34. Thank you.
On the bill, is there any member who'd like to be recognized on the bill? Senator Espaldon, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just a question to the author. I believe he mentioned that this small piece of property is part of a ponding basin. Is that correct?
Well, it's a depressed piece of property which right now serves as catches water, and it will continue to serve that purpose. So it isn't as if they're going to backfill it, and they're basically going to keep that as the drainage area for the lot that's being developed.
I appreciate that, and rightfully so. I guess my concern would be that if it's a natural ponding basin, maybe not a developed ponding basin, but a natural hole or sinkhole in which waters from the total surrounding areas actually flow into, if it is designated private property, would the private owners then, I guess, block off the access because of the way they develop this property? Would they block off the access of any other runoff coming from the neighborhood in total that could then go into that would normally go into that sinkhole? Because if other waters are prevented, other waters that are not upon this specific piece of property, developed piece of property, if the water is not allowed to flow into there, then the question becomes, where does it flow and what damage does it do in terms of erosion to other properties as well? So I guess I just raised that concern about this because we have seen other areas on our island where development has occurred and natural ponding basins have been developed or built over or not allowed to accept water runoff from the surrounding areas, and then we see other properties being adversely affected because the natural flow of water is not allowed to go into the natural ponding basin of the sinkhole. I raise that as an issue. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Espaldon. On the motion, any member wish to be heard? On Bill 298, as amended, Acting Speaker Terlahi, and then Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I note that this development was described in the Mariana's Business Journal recently, and I have no objection to the development. I note that the owner is the same owner as one of the electronic signs that has been put up on the Airport Road intersection, and I guess has developed that, remodeled that building there also. I guess what I'm looking for that I'm not seeing, and I'm thankful for the author pointing out that this is a ponding basin, but it looks like the property already went through the zoning process at the Guam Land Use Commission, the rezoning process, and it had been approved for rezoning. And in the Mariana's Business Journal, it says, the plaza will have about 180 parking spots for customers. As part of the overall project, the O's have also committed to developing and maintaining an access road that corners the property off of Route 3 that is an unapproved public easement. And so it didn't seem to contemplate that they were going to own it, just that they were going to maintain it as a public easement. And I think I'm concerned with the similar issues that were raised by my colleague prior to me, that if it's currently used as a ponding basin, and what are the implications of that? Because I don't see that. On the rezoning, it was probably discussed. We just don't have those documents in front of us. For example, they would have, other agencies would have been required to discuss what are the impacts to, the ponding basin, to have this development, or to rezone this property. And so I guess I feel a little uncomfortable about that. If it's possible for them to proceed, and it seems like it was possible for them to proceed while leaving this as a public easement, then I would just like to have some assurance that we are not giving up something that is actually necessary for all the people in the neighborhood. My other concern, of course, is that it's just that we have a lot of land issues on Guam that we need to take care of. We have people on Route 4 who have not been compensated for their land. We have people who need land exchanges because the government has made their land unusable for them. And I just hate to get into the business of selling off government land while we have all of those issues pending. We see often the Chamorro Land Trust Chamorro Land Trust Commission is asked to give up their land in order to create easements for water and even ponding basins sometimes, but water, power, and other types of easements that the public might need. And so I guess those are my concerns. It's like this priority of, selling the government land off, especially in this instance where it looks like they were able to get approval for their project, they are proceeding with their project, and they were able to get approval for the rezoning without owning this government land. And I would like to hear from the agencies whether they have a use for this land, if it's necessary by Public Works for the adjacent roads ponding basin, if it's necessary by DPW for, GWA, and if that information is available, then I'd like the opportunity to take a look at it. And otherwise, those are my concerns on the bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Sujus Maasi. Senator San Nicolas, you're recognized on the bill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the bill. Ponding basin notwithstanding, if we can remedy that concern, that would greatly, I think, alleviate a lot of the concerns of the members of this body. But ponding basin notwithstanding, here's why I'm actually attracted to this project. First, as is the case with what we've seen in several other measures that we've both passed in this body and also had a public hearing on last night. This is yet another example of a small sliver of government land smack in the middle of contiguously owned properties that is affecting the ability for those properties to develop and realize their full and fair value. In this particular strip here, what that basically does is it makes all the surrounding contiguous lots less able to be developed and also less able to be financed. But here's why, and I'm grateful for the author for providing the diagrams. The reason why this project excites me is twofold. One, it's going to be providing a new service station in the area, a new gas station. And access to fuel and perhaps even having one day more competitive fuel pricing, I think will be a very, very good thing for our community. But the other thing that really excites me about this, Madam Speaker, is the proximity of this development to the neighborhood that it's in. If we take a close look at the map, the aerial map, it shows that this is going to be within the Estumbo area. And one of the things, Madam Speaker, that I've encountered on a regular basis is because our public transportation system has lots to be desired, a lot of our people are unable to go to work because they're unable to have reliable transportation. When we have developments like these in high-density population areas where people can actually walk to their jobs, it creates job opportunities for the community. And based on this diagram, it looks like there's going to be a number of job opportunities for the entire community to be able to avail of. And it excites me to be able to speak in favor of potential developments in neighborhoods that are in high need of more job opportunities. The Estumbo area, there's a lot of our people who live up there. I know that they're hardworking people, but sometimes people being able to go to find work is very, very limited because of the public transportation challenges. This development, it's not going to solve all the employment problems of the community, but at least it creates some jobs. And I would like to, on the record, implore that the developer please consider hiring within the community. I'm sure that's something that they can look at very closely. But these kind of opportunities require investment. They require people to be able to inject the capital to help the community have these kind of job opportunities. And if the only thing standing in the way of developing this opportunity for people to be able to avail of jobs in the area is a 600 square meter strip, similar to other strips that we've addressed here in this body, then I think that it behooves us to remedy this situation and to, for the fair market value, sell that strip, which is, I wish that we could be showing these things on the screen because it's a very, you won't be able to exchange this land for anybody who, anybody who has any outstanding land issues on this island. This is clearly one of those issues where the government has a very small piece of property that's just in the way of a very good opportunity for the community. And not only will the proceeds of the, not only will the selling of this lot allow for the property to actually be developed and create these job opportunities and provide a new gas station in the area, but the proceeds will also go again into the Chamorro Land Trust Fund. And those monies are desperately needed for surveying and getting more lands out to our people. So the more we can sell these odd-sized, pretty much useless strips and create these job opportunities and also generate the revenue to be able to survey more actual usable land for our people, it becomes a win-win. The community wins, the jobs are created, the opportunities are available, and then the revenue is provided for us to actually survey and get lands out of the land trust and into the hands of our people that's actually usable. This strip is not usable. So again, though, ponding basin notwithstanding, that would be a concern, so I do want to just raise that. But ponding basin notwithstanding, this is something that this community could very much do, this community could very much benefit from. It's mentioned here in the diagram, if I just read off what some of the ideas are here, is a gas station. They're looking to potentially have a bank up there. People will be able to walk and do their banking, a convenience store, and then some additional units and standalone units for other shops as well. So I hope that we can favorably consider this project. I think that this is something that will benefit the community, benefit the need to generate revenue for the surveying of Chamorro Land Trust lands, and also taking these useless government strips and letting them be put to their highest and best use for the benefit of the people in the area. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Mrs. Masi, Senator San Nicolas. Senator Atta, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just would like to provide a point of clarification. I apologize. I misspoke. That 274 square meter piece of property is not a ponding basin. It is an easement, and the property, although the property is somewhat depressed, I got somewhat confused with. I'm dealing with so many land bills, but here's the summary of important facts from the appraisal document that is in the committee report. And it reads, Bill 298, introduced by Senator Atta, is an act to authorize the sale of Lot 31, consisting of 274 square meters, which is an abandoned, undeveloped easement. According to the bill, the Lot 31 is a 20-foot wide designated easement created to provide access to adjacent lots 14, 16, and 27, which consists of that L-shaped property that is shown on the graphics that I provided. So by then being able to purchase that easement, then basically the lot is not divided where that easement is. They could then basically take the whole lot and consolidate it and then provide their access as necessary. As a result of selling this particular 274 square meter easement, it will not landlock any of the other properties involved because this easement goes into that consolidated property of the individual who's asking to buy this easement. So I apologize if I may have caused confusion. It is not a ponding basin. It is an abandoned easement that is somewhat depressed, but it is not a ponding basin. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Masi, Senator Atta. On the main motion, Acting Speaker, you're recognized.
If I may just pose a question to the author on the information that he just provided. Can you clarify this statement in the Marianas Business Journal as to the restrictions that were imposed on the rezoning of this development? So on the owners' lots that they currently own, they asked for rezoning and were granted a commercial zone. And this article leads me to believe that it was with restrictions, and because this sentence says, as part of the overall project, the O's have also committed to developing and maintaining an access road that corners the property off of Route 3 that is an unapproved public easement. And so again, that seems to imply that they're going to maintain this for the public as a public easement as opposed to purchasing it and cutting the public off of it for some reason, unless it's referring to some other road. And I would just like maybe if we could take a break or pass on it until we get that information, and then I would be satisfied with at least that portion of it. Thanks.
Senator Atta, do you yield to the Acting Speaker's question?
Well, I think the individual who raised the issue read very clearly what the restriction is that they have to provide access. And so, you know, if that's the restriction, what else can I add to that?
Thank you, Acting Speaker.
It seems to me that this bill, if we approve the purchasing the land, then we remove it as a public easement. We are removing that requirement that they maintain an access road that corners the property off of Route 3 that is an unapproved public easement. And so we are going around that condition that was imposed on them in the rezoning. So I'd like to clarify that, and I would just need a little more time.
Senator Masi, Senator Ada, and then Senator San Nicolas.
Well, maintain a public easement into a private property, that doesn't make sense. So the motion, if she's making a motion to set it aside, I would object to that.
Senator San Nicolas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In light of the motion and the objection, if I could request that the clerk or the House please put on the screen the map that shows the easement, because I mean very clearly with respect to the objection, this strip is right into the heart of all the private properties that are contiguously owned. The access that is of concern is access to those properties that are already owned by that individual property owner. And so selling this strip isn't going to restrict public access to any publicly usable lands. You go down that strip of road, you're not going to be able to go anywhere because it's surrounded by the private property of the contiguous landowner. So if I could request, Madam Speaker, that we please put this map up on the screen so we can clearly see what it is that we're discussing for the benefit of the body and the viewing public.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. It's my understanding that our MIS is currently working on scanning these maps so that it can be visible to all the members on the screen as well as the viewing and listening public. So we'll take a brief recess to allow for them to continue.
Madam Chair, I would move that we recess until 2, and that way I can also check Department of Land Management. That's really the only person who can clarify the information that we need. What were the conditions placed on this rezoning?
Senator Masi, the legislature will be in recess until 2 p.m.